Wes Pres Kids, it's good to be with you again today, and I'm excited to bring you another story from the book of Acts as we follow along with Peter and his activity. Now, Peter, in this story, is going to meet a man named Cornelius. Now, Cornelius was a Roman centurion. That means he was a soldier in the Roman army, and he was actually an officer in charge of at least 100 other soldiers. Now, Cornelius, we're told, was actually a very good man, and he was very generous and did all kinds of good things for people that were in need. And we also learned that Cornelius was a religious man as well, and would spend a lot of time in the Jewish synagogue and helping the Jews in his city. And so as the story begins today, we meet Cornelius while he is in a time of prayer when a special visitor, an angel, comes to speak to him.
I want you to go send for Peter.
Once the angel told Cornelius to go get Peter, he found out that Peter was actually in a nearby town, Joppa, where we left him last week with the story with Tabitha. And so Cornelius, being a centurion, a man in charge of other soldiers and servants, tells some of them,
Go get Peter.
Now here the story actually jumps to Peter, where we learn that he too is actually praying. And while he's praying, he ends up having this really strange vision. And a vision is kind of like a daydream, only with meaning or with a purpose. Like, have you ever had a daydream before, something that you kind of imagined while you were awake? It's kind of like a dream, but you're just thinking of something else. Well, a vision might be kind of like this, but a vision, again, has some sense of meaning. Like, Peter knows that this vision is supposed to mean something, and he's trying to figure out what it means. But what's interesting about this vision is that he also hears a voice along with it. Peter, take and eat.
I will never eat anything that's bad for me.
Don't call anything bad that I have made clean. Now, in this vision, we learn that Peter sees this sheet coming down out of the heavens, and it's full of all different kinds of animals. And the Bible tells us that there's reptiles and birds and all kinds of animals in this sheet. And then God, or this voice, says, take and eat. And Peter was a Jew, however, and Jews had very specific laws and rules about what they were allowed to eat and what they weren't allowed to eat. And so Peter is really confused by the vision and the voice, because the voice says that he's supposed to eat these animals that he knows he's not supposed to eat. And so he says, Lord, I will not eat these animals that aren't clean or aren't good for me. But the voice says, don't call anything unclean that I have, or don't call anything bad that I have made good or made clean, that you could eat them. And so Peter is in this really big conundrum about what should he do. Should he do what he's always done, which is not eat these animals, or is he now allowed to eat these animals? What do you think Peter should do? Well, in the Bible, it tells us that this vision happens 3 times.
Peter, take and eat. Don't call anything bad that I have made clean. Peter, take and eat. Don't call anything bad that I have made clean. Peter, take and eat. Don't call anything bad that I have made clean.
Well, after Peter has this vision 3 times, the voice then tells him that there are some men that have come to get him and that he is supposed to go with them. And of course, we know as the readers of the story that these are the men that came from Cornelius's house. And so Peter goes to Cornelius' house and he meets him.
Peter, come in. I usually wouldn't come to your house, but God told me I can go to anyone's house. But you.
Well, after Peter goes into Cornelius' house, he begins to talk with the people there and tell them about Jesus and his life and ministry and death and resurrection. But in this story, it's also really interesting because Peter himself learns a really valuable lesson about what God is doing and what God is up to, what God is like. And actually, even if just reading from the Bible, there's a couple of verses that I think are really important to hear that Peter says to Cornelius and to the people in the house. He says, God has shown me that I should never call a person impure or unclean. Now, impure and unclean, those were religious words for essentially kind of like good for you, maybe, or bad for you. So Peter's saying, God has showed me that I should never call somebody bad or unclean. And then the other thing that Peter says is really interesting. He says that God doesn't show partiality to one group of people over another. So Peter in this story not only learns that he should not call people bad, but also that God doesn't necessarily prefer one group of people over another group of people. And this is a really valuable lesson, I think, for us to learn. Because we have all kinds of people in our life that we maybe think are bad, or people that we don't like, or people that we even maybe like to think that we're better than sometimes. But this story reminds us that this just isn't true, especially from God's point of view, that maybe we're all beloved, that we're all wonderful people in God's sight, and that nobody is bad. And the other thing that's important here in this story is that no group of people is not liked by God, or in the way that Peter says it, that God shows no partiality. God has no preference for one group of people over another. And yet, honestly, so often throughout human history, as maybe you're learning in school, that sometimes people behave like that, right? We think that white people are better than black people, or better than Asian people, or better than Native American people. You have all sorts of terrible things that have happened in the history of humankind. But right here in this story, it's this beautiful acknowledgement of God's love for every single group of people. So, my friends, my encouragement for you to think about this week in your spiritual growth, are there people that you have a hard time liking? Are there people that you like to think of as bad? Or are there even a group of people that maybe you think of as bad? And maybe you could learn to think about them in the way that God sees them, that God still sees them as wonderful, beautiful children of God, creations of God's. And maybe you could ask God to love them and to see them differently. Well, this is a hard lesson that I think it takes a lot of us all our lives to learn how to do, and really to do over and over and over and over again. Well, grace and peace to you, and it was good to see you. Bye.
Peter, come in. Usually I want to come to your house, but I can't. But God told me I can come to anyone's house. What did you say?
Right.
Come in.
Action.
Peter, come in. Let's go. No.
All right, just say
Sure, just say, Peter, come in.